Okay, so it's 9 o'clock and we are delighted to welcome you to our first core webinar on research ethics. I am Elisabeth Staksrud, the VP leader of the ethics in the core project, which you can read more about online. I have with me some of my colleagues that are going to contribute today from different parts of the world on research ethics. And hopefully our intention today is not necessarily to tell you what to do. We don't want to do that, but we want to highlight some of the ethical issues, especially those that have arisen during COVID or might have been highlighted. And then hopefully we can generate some buzz, some interest, and a great conversation. And on that note, if you have any questions, if you have any concerns, if you want to tell us something, if you want us to discuss something together with you or look at it, you can always have your questions in and put your questions in the Q&A, or you can send this to us later, and we will have a panel discussion and a Q&A at the end after our presentations. Okay, so I think we're ready to start. I'm going to share my presentation because I'm first up, and then my colleagues will continue later. So this is the webinar of the core project. We call it Research and Evidence, and we are highlighting ethical dilemmas. And in today's webinar, just to briefly recap what we're going to do, we are going to start now with me presenting a little bit about ethics and informed consent and how to think about or perhaps work with ethical dilemmas when you research and work with children during a crisis. Then we will have some insights from Vidar and Ingrid on the development of ethical guidelines for internet research in Norway. Then our colleague from the Catholic University of Milan, Giovanna, Mascheroni, will say something about potential ethical challenges that can arise when engaging with very young children in research online. We will have then a presentation from Brady Robards at the Monash University in Australia about researching young people in network publics and ethical challenges and opportunities that bring. And then after that, we will have panel discussions and Q&A answers from the public. And we will end at the latest at 11:30, and we are looking forward, all of us, to this. So, to start us off, I wanted to say something about research ethics, or not the whole thing, but we're going to say something about ethics and informed consent and how this creates all kinds of challenges, complications, questions when we work with children. So my name is Elisabeth Staksrud. I am a professor at the Department of Media Communication at the University of Oslo. I'm also the chair of the National Ethics Committee for Research Ethics in Social Sciences and the Humanities in Norway, and the chair of the Children, Youth and Media section at ECREA, the European Communication Research and Education Association. So that's my background, that's where I'm coming from. And that doesn't really matter because no matter what kind of research I do or what we've done so far, COVID happened. And when COVID happens, something happens to all of us. One thing is what happens in your house, in your home, but it also has done something with research. And to try to very crudely sum that up, we can see that we have a period from where we know our methods, we know how to do things, hopefully at least, and suddenly we cannot go out in the field as we usually do. We cannot go into classrooms and collect data. We cannot go into homes and collect data. People are scared. There is a huge crisis going on. We have all these infections. So researchers find themselves having to collect their data online, where they before would have other methods. We also see, and we are many of us in a situation where projects, PhDs and students are delayed in their work. So you made your excellent plan on how to collect your data, how to research, how to do this. You might even have gotten approval from your university, your ethics committee, whatever, and then suddenly you have to change it all because COVID happened. So we see that many need to quickly change their research projects and methods from data collection offline into online interviews or surveys or experiments. And this also creates challenges because there are some pitfalls or some challenges or some dilemmas that happens when you do research online that you might not necessarily think about in the same way when you do research offline. And what we're trying today is to try to get the conversation going about what these special circumstances might be. And also, I think there's a sense of urgency in the research field. Especially for working with children's online engagements or children's welfare or anything to do with children and youth and adolescents, there's an urgency of thinking something is happening with the society that impacts children a lot, and we need to figure out what that is during and because of COVID. So a lot of research projects have been generated because of COVID that has this time sensitivity, which is also puts things under pressure. And of course, we all then have to go take new rounds of administrative procedures and approvals and all these things that you all or either know about or will know about once you start working with your own research. So in this, what then about the ethics? Does it change? Is there something we can do? Is the ethics a challenge? Is it a problem? What do we do? And for many, and having conversations with researchers across the world, I often hear this, research becomes this really inconvenient obstacle. It's like, all these problems occurred. COVID occurred. My university wants me to teach online and I need to collect my data. And then you want me to also consider a new ethics procedure. And what I'm going to tell you now is that it's going to be okay. But the question I get, seem to be getting, and this is partly as working with research ethics, is can we bend the ethical requirements because there is a time of crisis? Could we perhaps allow ourselves some leeway in the ethical considerations because this is an unprecedented situation for us? And to this, there is a right or wrong answer. And the answer is no, we cannot. And I'm just going to remind us that the basis for informed consent and what we're going to talk about today comes from the Nuremberg proceedings, where the 10 points of how to do research coming out of that whole crisis, which was also a crisis, a huge crisis, lasted years and years and killed millions and millions of people, was that the consent of the human subject is absolutely necessary. That's the first point. So if we are to learn from history, which we should, so we don't repeat the mistakes, we would say that perhaps it is in times of crisis that we really need to pay attention to the research ethics so we don't make mistakes. So research ethics is a lot of things, but I'm going to talk about what I consider as the holy grail in research ethics, which is informed consent. And what is this? Well, for many of us, when we hear we need informed consent, we start to break out in sweat, as I do, and I start to think about GDPR. For those of you who are fortunate enough not to live in a place where you have to consider this, I mean, GDPR is good, but what is GDPR? So GDPR is a general data protection regulation in Europe, which is considered also by EU to be the toughest privacy and security law in the world. GDPR basically has to do with collecting personal information from anyone. And that also applies to researchers. So if you want to collect something from a person that has sensitive or personal information, you need consent. This is a legal requirement. But importantly, GDPR only deals with personal information collected by law, and research ethics is so much more. But GDPR, I think, for many has caused all sorts of challenges. So this is, and working with the ethics committee in Norway, we see, different kinds of cases. And this is an actual case, and I've seen many of them, where the GDPR is read as what you need to get your informants to consent to before you can start doing research. And then there's all these legal requirements. And this is something, and mind you that I am Norwegian, and in Norway we speak Norwegian, not English. And this was an example, verbatim, of an informed consent that was given to children and parents in Norway who were asked to participate in a research project. Because the fear of researchers, and perhaps also of research institutions, to make mistakes in terms of how to collect personal data seems to take up so much of our capacity and so much time. We're so afraid of making legally mistakes that we end up perhaps not paying too much attention to the ethics, or that we confuse this legal requirement of collecting personal data with ethics. So, for instance, telling a child, I want you to participate in my research, and then also cite, you should know that supervising authorities have power to impose significant fines up to 20 million euros, or 4% of total worldwide annual turnover for users that do not comply with the GDPR, might not be helpful for an 8-year-old. But still, I see this again and again. And in that, I should also say that because of GDPR and the way it's structured legally, I can also see again and again in consent form that it says, we have the right. It's like, we would like you to participate in our research, but please know, we have the right to collect your data because of, and then there's a lot of legal citations and references. This is another example, which is like a standard example, which is also typically used for these types of consent forms. Protection of personal information. As this will involve the handling of personal data, it's subject to data protection rules established by regulation so-and-so, and data controller and data processor, and the general data protection regulation. But is this helpful to the regular parent or child that is actually going to consider, should I participate in this research or not? Or is it alienating? Do we need something else? Or is this sufficient in terms of thinking about consent? This is where I would like to introduce to you the ethical informed consent, which is different, completely different. I mean, okay, it has some overlap with consent to collect personal information, but it's also so much more. But the ethical informed consent, that is what we need to really pay attention to as researchers rather than data controllers. And that entails so much more. So what does it entail? And this is not an exhaustive list, but I'll give you some examples. For instance, we need to tell children and their parents, why are we asking you specifically to participate in our research? What will we ask you to do? For how long will we ask you to do this? And why will we ask you to do this? Who else will be there? That you can change your mind at any time and no one will be upset or mad at you. You actually have the right to say no. Who is responsible for this research and this project, and who is funding it? This is something we tend to forget all the time, actually telling who is behind this research in terms of the cash. How will this research be used? How will we tell you about our findings and results? How will we report back to you as an informant? If you will be anonymized or not? Who will be able to see what you have answered or done or contributed in the research, and your right to say no, even if somebody else thinks that you should say yes? Or your actual opportunity to say no, even if somebody else says yes, or everybody else says yes, like in classrooms. Do we really give children the opportunity to say, I don't want to participate, if the rest of the class says, yes, let's do this? Or are we creating a stigma? All these dilemmas that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, that is the ethical consent. And then, of course, asking both parents and children themselves to consent and respecting what they say, even though in legal terms, they might have to be 16, and before that, it is the parents who consent. And all this has to be done in a neutral and child-friendly language. So easy peasy, not as complicated as GDPR. Okay, so finally, I'm going to give you a few examples of some known challenges with the ethical informed consent and researching children and adolescents. Or I could have called this slide mistakes I might have made at some point in my research. So the first one is understanding that a children's capacity to consent in research is evolving, typically by age and maturity, but their capacity to understand and say no comes much before their capacity to say yes. So picking up on cues and respecting that a child might not want to participate in research, and respecting that even though their parents might have said yes, is one of these dilemmas and one of these considerations that we need to deal with. How, if I go to a house, or if I set up an interview on Zoom and the parents are really enthusiastic and the child doesn't want to participate, what do I do then? The second is what I typically refer to as the unicorn consent. So the unicorn consent is what is extremely tempting when you desperately try to get your informants, and we all, most of us at least, know that it's often really hard to get informants for our research. And it's really tempting when we want to recruit children and parents for our research to present research as something fun, because we think it is. Something that you might be missing out of it. I mean, the focus group, it's almost like a party. There will be really nice people there. We will have soda. Maybe you will get a gift at the end. And presenting information in a neutral, extremely boring manner is ethically sound. Presenting it as something that you would be really missing out is perhaps more problematic. Another challenge that comes across a lot is when parents, when we try to collect data from children and we promise them confidentiality and anonymity, and parents agree to this, but later they will change their mind and they will demand to know what their child has answered. Legally, many parents can say, I have the right to do this. This is a minor. You are a stranger. What do you do then? And how do you keep the trust with children in research when they and their parents might not always see it the same way or have the same interest in mind? And this, of course, highlighted in internet research, because if you do interviews online, via Zoom, via Skype, via any other kind of online, who else is in the room? How do you preserve anonymity or confidentiality if you can see the whole room, if you cannot control the setting? This is something we have to consider in relation to COVID research. Similarly, considering that you have to have respect for others not directly included in research, and that you need to consider and anticipate the effects of other people that are not directly included in research. We know this when we go into schools. There are other children there. They will also be affected, although they're not your research subject. The same in childcare centers and in other places, and also online. So what do we do then? And of course, the complication of the let's be friend consent, that if you connect with somebody online, they're very likely to be able to see you and your profile and your net life. And maybe they want to be friends on Facebook, and maybe they want to congratulate you with your birthday. And how do we make sure that we explain the participants the limitations and expectations and requirements associated with our role as researchers? And finally, how do we keep our duty to inform if we discover during our research and collecting processes that a child is at risk? And how do we do that when our interview is conducted online? Do we have protocols for this? Have we thought this through? This is something that we perhaps also need to discuss. So I think what I want to say is that informed consent in research, in terms of ethics, it's not about the GDPR. GDPR is about privacy and collecting personal information and your right not to be seen. Research ethics, on the other hand, is more about trying to look into the future, anticipating the different things that can happen, and then plan for them with respect for the informants. And finally, I'll give you a pro tip. So having reviewed hundreds and hundreds of research projects in terms of ethics, very often I can tell you that if you think you have a problem with the ethics and the ethics is ruining your project, I would take another look at the research design. Very often a slight change in your method will solve the full ethical problem. Okay, so this you can do, and thank you for listening. And I will now give the room or the screen to Vidar, Enebakk and Ingrid Torp from NESH in Norway.
So thank you, Elisabeth. My name is Ingrid Torp, and I work and will present with Vidar Enebakk, as Elisabeth said, and we are from the Norwegian National Research Ethics Committees. So we wanted to start by showing you our website, which you can reach by going to researchethics.no, because we have a lot of resources, books and articles also on research with children. And we do have a research ethics magazine, and it's all free on our webpage, so you can order and get it by mail also. The Norwegian National Research Ethics Committees is a governmental body, but it has independent committees and commissions, which consist of researchers, lawyers, other professionals, and also lay people. So in Norway, we do have a research ethics law that requires all research institutions to comply with research ethical guidelines. And these guidelines, they're made by our committees, especially the Committees for Natural Sciences and Technology, NENT, and the Committee for Social Sciences and the Humanity, called NESH. And Vidar is the director of NESH, so he's going to tell you a bit more about how they work with the guidelines.
I'll just say a few words about the main guidelines provided by NESH before we focus on the other guidelines, which is more specifically linked to internet research. And I just want to make two points in reference to the main guidelines. So when moving beyond the GDPR, we need some kind of guidelines to read and reflect upon when making ethical judgment, and this is what our national committees provide. And I just want to make 2 points in reference to these guidelines. This is where we set out the overall ethical principles, which covers these disciplines, social science and humanities. Today, what is at the core is part B, which has to do with the participants, informed consent, and so forth. But the first point I want to make is that these guidelines have they go beyond, they have a much broader scope, and they outline research in a very broad sense in the relation between science and society in general. So covering everything that has to do with social responsibility and also trust. So it's a broad concept of research ethics in which the participants, of course, have a central role. The second point is that the guidelines is a living document. It has to be, because ethics is based on experience. So when NESH was established in 1990, the first thing the committee did was to make guidelines, and they were published. The first set was published in 1993 and then revised numerous times in 1999, 2006, and 2016, based both on specific cases which had been dealt with in the committee and new emerging topics as well. So the point is that the guidelines are made by researchers in the independent committee with input from the research community for researchers to be used in their own practice. So the committee sort of owns the content of the ethics. It's not defined by the law. And they're being constantly revisited, revised, and we're currently actually undergoing a new revision. So as of this week, we received more than 50 inputs from researchers and research institutions, and we'll now go on to make a new edition of the NESH guidelines, which will be available in the spring. It will also be translated, so I hope it will be useful for other people abroad as well. But the main point to bring out is that despite these new developments in the revisions, the ethics at the core remains stable. The ethics basically remains the same, but sentences and the formulation has to be revised and specified. That's the big message. Although things change, the ethic remains remarkably steady. So when we went on to make guidelines for research ethics, because sometimes, of course, you have emerging topics which cover requires more specific guidelines. So with the emergence of internet research ethics, NESH, as early as 2003, saw the need to develop a specific guide to research ethics. And this guide was revised and republished in 2019, based on a rather broad process, because by this time we had to go through all the new developments, and there is a lot of new developments, AI, big data, and so forth. And I think a very important experience that we had in NESH was that this topic became too big. When we started to look into big data, it became too big for NESH as a specific committee to cover the whole field itself. So in this case, we had to sort of narrow it down to focus more specifically on the question of informed consent, and then leave the broader questions to be handled by FEC in another publication, which Ingrid will talk more about afterwards. But the other interesting thing is that when dealing with informed consent in internet research, another question became more important, namely the first, what is private and what is public? And the whole way we need to think about what is private and what is public, is there a requirement before we do the judgment whether we need informed consent or not? And in this, for instance, of course, we have informed consent as a main principle, but there are justified exemptions. For instance, when can a statement made online be considered to be public? That takes some thinking. What rules apply to public figures in power? What is public about their role, and how can we think about that? And when can research be considered to be in the public interest? So already here we had 3 ways of thinking about whether the information, which we need to think about before we make this judgment. And to facilitate this process, NESH suggests 2 sort of academic notions which can be useful. First, what is the reasonable expectation of publicity? How can we think about how they think about publicity? That's one way to work, that's a concept that can work. And the other is contextual integrity. What is the context in which the information is being shared? And by working with these topics, we might come up with some responsible judgments. And to sum up quite shortly what the message is, even though the information is not necessarily public, even though it's openly available, and people might have pockets of privacy, even within the broader public sphere. So we need to think about the public and the private in a different way, also online. And one example here, which was important for NESH, is taken from sort of a cafe. When you sit in a cafe and you listen to people, young children talking about sensitive information, it's not okay just to record it and then research it and publish it, because they have a private space in the public sphere. And this also goes in analogy for internet research ethics. And NESH actually had to deal with this in a specific case, where a researcher actually had followed a group of young people sharing sensitive information about their disease, and then publishing it in a way that made some of these young people identifiable in the publication. And this is the kind of things that we need to avoid, and that's why we need these tools and guidelines to think about this in an ethical sense. And the best way to sum it up, and this is also some of the basis for this way of formulating it in the NESH guidelines, is taken from a book that was published by the ethics committees in 2015 called Internet Research Ethics. In this book, there's a paper by Dag Elgesem on consent and information, and he borrows this model, as you can see, from McKee and Porter 2009, on how these 4 dimensions are needed to be taken into account when judging whether informed consent is necessary. So it's the information private or public, it's the topic sensitivity high or low, it's the degree of interaction high or low, and what about subject vulnerability? Is it high and low? And when thinking about this and sort of grading it in different scales, you might end up with a sort of clear argument whether consent is necessary or not. And the point is, of course, that this is not meant in a sort of technical way. These are dimensions that we need to reflect within to make a responsible judgment of whether consent is necessary and not. And it shows why ethical reflection is at the core, not just rule following as in law, as in GDPR. And in that way, by sort of outlining guidelines and formulating principles and arguments that can be used in ethical reflection, these guidelines could be used to sort of reach beyond the law of the GDPR. Ingrid?
Thank you. So on that note, we had to sort of pick up the pieces from NESH when they realized that big data was too big for them. The scope of big data was too big. And also the other committees realized that there are issues here that we need to look into. So we made the disciplinary working group that have finished this report, and it was published this fall. So it's on our website. For now, it's in Norwegian. It will be translated. But we had two main questions. Those were, how does big data change research, and which norms are tested? So we realized that many principles are tested, like the quality of research, fair access to data, and respect for individuals and groups. But on this occasion, I will concentrate on the effects of big data research on consent and privacy. So with big data research, we found that consent sort of becomes abstract. Data that was typically collected by the researcher, given to him in a direct connection to the research participant, is now increasingly collected by large tech companies. They are collected through sensors and apps used voluntarily and continuously, and through large scientific programs that sometimes may not have a specific goal. And this also applies to children. Data is collected extensively from children all the time. And I wanted to show you just some of this data production. How much data is produced. Vidar, if you could show that slide. Through certain services every single minute. So it just, and this has to do with children a lot, because these are services used by them. And so you've probably seen a lot of these graphics, but I think it's a good illustration. So with big data, there is also a concern for re-identification, and this can happen through the connection of different data sets that are in themselves anonymous, but when you connect them, the total amount of information makes them non-anonymous. Yeah. Or there can be new methods to make previously harmless information personal. So one discussion that has to do with this is in genetics. How much of your genetic code is needed to identify you, and how will this change over time? So this brings us back to the question of consent. And as a researcher working with big data, it's part of your duty, according to the norms of research ethics, to know and inform your research participants about the risks, such as re-identification. So in the report, we try to sum up some alternatives to the classical consent, because it might be very difficult to have a classical consent. So the broad consent is mentioned, where research within broadly defined research topics can be made without the need to obtain consent again. And with tiered consent, you can allow participants to opt in and opt out on general research areas. So we give some recommendations to researchers, and we also give some recommendations to the institutions, like facilitating technical solutions. And just to remind you, to remind us all what's at stake, I wanted to show you this graphic from Statista that says how the share of internet users who are more concerned about their online privacy now compared to a year ago. This was in 2019, but there's no reason to think it's going in a different direction this year. So you can see people are getting more concerned. And working on the report, I mean, we realized that the basic scientific norms do not need to be revised to meet new challenges, but our understanding of them has to be revised and debated constantly, as Vidar also said. And so the report is, for now, open-ended. We published it, but we are asking for input so that we can keep updating it. And to end it all, I wanted to show you just this logo to remind us all what's at stake and how fragile the trust in science can be. So big data research has to respect the research ethical norms, or else it could easily damage trust in science. Thank you.
Thank you, Ingrid. And so we will now hear from Giovanna Mascheroni. I'll just put you in the spotlight, Giovanna, so that you can share your presentation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Niam, and thank you, Elisabeth, for inviting to share my experience in this very important webinar. Thank you for the other panelists who have anticipated some of the issues I'd like to address today. But first, a short introduction. I'm Giovanna Mascheroni. I'm an associate professor of sociology of media at the Catholic University of Milan. I'm part of the EU Kids Online network and also part of the ySKILLS and part of the Italian team working for CORE, even though my colleague Piermarco Roldi is doing most of the job. And so I'm very happy to contribute at least with this participation. Let me share my screen, and what I'd like to talk about today has to do with deals with the issue of ethical challenges in doing research with young children, especially. And I have no answers, as Elisabeth said, but I'll try to raise some questions that I'd like to discuss with you all. So the methodological and ethical challenges of doing child-centered research with young children are similar and at the same time a little bit peculiar, a little bit different compared to doing research with older children or with adults. And more specifically, if we look at how studies of childhood, especially in the field of education or sociology of childhood, dealt with the issue of consent, we can first recognize how consent as a purely verbal agreement has been challenged. So the idea is that especially younger children do not express consent also only through a verbal agreement, especially because they are not legally entitled to do so. But they do express their willingness to take part in the research in non-verbal ways. So there's a suggestion to be reflexively aware of how children communicate their willingness or not, even, for example, if they are tired, reluctant in taking part to research activities. So we must pay attention to non-verbal language as well. Another problem that I faced and that Elisabeth anticipated in her presentation is the fact that no matter how playful we try to be, and no matter how much we try to perform a least adult role, we still are perceived as adults by children. And this means that there are important power relations that we need to address, especially when we do research in the domestic context, where there's a triangulation of power role, so the child, the parents, and the researcher. And we have to recognize that sometimes both parents and children actually do have different agendas for participation. So what shall we do, for example, if parents give their consent, but we see that the child is reluctant and, well, parents told them to take part in the research, but they are not really persuaded and they don't find it very much interested. So we have to again pay attention to nonverbal language beyond writing an informed consent that is adapted to the child age and development. And last point that I found particularly stimulating is the suggestion to match research methods to children's own interests. So to design research activities that actually are interesting and stimulated for children to take part in, provided that they are also empirically valuable for us as researcher. And let me share, so in thinking how we address the challenges of doing research with young children in an ethical way during COVID, I first thought of one of my last research experiences. This is not, I'm not taking this as a best practice. It had some limitations as well, but this helps me to formulate some questions and challenges as to what I could do now if I had to reproduce the same research design. So this was a research project funded by the Australian Research Council and coordinated by my colleague at Edith Cowan University, Donnell Holloway. And it was a research on children and the Internet of Toys. And the first decision that we made, and maybe ethical or not, I had some reservation myself, was to provide children with a robotic, an internet-connected robotic toy, which is called Cosmo, and you can see in the smaller picture on the screen. We had different informed consent, especially for children of different ages. I must say that the Italian version of the parents' consent was included also 2 full pages written very small about the GDPR, because we were sharing data with Australia, so that complicated things enormously. And the legal office at my university was particularly keen to comply with the GDPR issues, so probably GDPR compliant more than ethical consent for parents. The children consent was different. Anyway, the research project was articulated in 3 moments. So we had a first family visit with a parent's interview, and then an interview with children in the form of a play tour. So children were asked to show around their games, their toys, and how they spent their leisure time at home. At the end of the first interview, we gave children a Cosmo, and we asked parents to film and take pictures of children's interactions with Cosmo in between the visits. And the second family visit involved, again, an interview with parents, mainly a verbal interview with parents, which used the videos and the photos they shared as an initial stimuli for conversation. And then the activity with children was the co-construction of a Cosmo story within the family through a book creator app. And this was something that the children enjoyed very much. And you have an example through in Italian on the right side of your screen. So what are the challenges that I see in doing this same kind of research now during lockdown or restrictions to physical proximity anyway? The first has to do with consent and assent. How can we best capture and recognize non-verbal language when we are online, and how can we build trust with children? It usually takes longer than with adults, and this might be complicated when moving research online. There's an additional layer of complexity and ethical issues when it comes to the platform that we choose. Because of course, then we do not only have to deal with how we store and treat and analyze the data, but also how the platform we chose to use is treating personal data. Let me give an example, a practical example. If you record a session on Zoom, for example, it is you can store it on your personal computer, but if you use Teams, as many universities decided to use as a business platform, then the recording is stored online in the cloud. So this is not compliant and not ethical with doing research with children. And again, how can we design a research that is child-centered? So child-centered research means to design methods that are interesting for children. As I said, it also means to acknowledge how, reflexively acknowledge how every empirical data is actually the contingent product of an interaction characterized by power imbalances. But what happens when technology fits in the relationship between children and researchers? And how can we design research that adapts to children's, for example, children's ability to stay online for long? I see my daughter, who is 4. She is now having drama and visual art classes online, and she does not manage to keep focused more than 20 minutes. So in one way, one suggestion would be design shorter research encounters, but then how can you maintain consent and trust over time? So there are pros and cons about what I'm saying. So these are some tips, some guidelines that I would recommend when designing research with young children in COVID times. So the first is to acknowledge the complexity of consent, to carefully choose the right platform, one which ensures better, higher privacy standards, design positive research experiences for children, be respectful of children's own attention span, pace and lifestyle, and probably a good viable solution to collect data in a way that adapts to children's everyday lives would be to engage both children and parents as co-researchers, by having in mind that parents' agendas for participation might actually be different from children's consent. Thank you very much. I'm gonna stop.
Thank you so much, Giovanna, and thank you to all of our panelists so far. I think there's a lot of food for thought here in terms of what to consider when engaging in research with children and about children online. I just want to remind the attendees that there is an opportunity, and we will have time to discuss questions, and we would really like to hear from you and to know what kind of questions you might be sitting with. We have one participant who has, or attendee who has posted in the Q&A, so please feel free to use that function, and also to write in the chat if you have questions or things that you think of as you react to what you're hearing and what the presenters are talking about. If you would like to, we can also allow you, with all of our controls, to pose the question in person. So just write in brackets that you would like to for us to allow you to talk, to present your own question as well, and we can make sure that you can do that. So I will just, the final presentation is from Brady Robards, who is in Australia, and because of the time at which we were presenting, it wouldn't have been possible for him to be with us live. So he has actually pre-recorded his presentation. So I am just going to show that to you. So I will play this presentation for you. So if you just give me 1 second, I will be able to share my screen as well. Now, here is Brady Robards.
Hello, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of this session. My name's Brady Robards and I'm a Senior Research Fellow in Sociology at Monash University, and I'm also funded by the Australian Research Council to study young people's social media use. I'm coming to you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of Kulin Nations, and I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the Indigenous owners and custodians of this land where sovereignty was never ceded. These lands now known as Melbourne in Australia. Thank you so much to the organisers of this event for inviting me to contribute. I'm really sorry that I can't be there with you in person because of this global pandemic, but also synchronously in real time because of the time zones. But I'm really keen to contribute. I'm so glad that an event like this is happening to talk about ethics when it comes to working with young people in terms of research ethics more generally, but in my case, in terms of social media and internet use more specifically. So today, what I want to talk about is working with young people in networked publics or in social media spaces, and thinking about a particular method that I've developed with my colleague and co-author, Sean Lincoln, which involves scrolling back through social media with young people as co-analysts of their own digital traces. So let's talk a little bit more about this method. So the social media scrollback method involves sitting with research participants as co-analysts of their own digital traces. And this is a really important part of the process. It's not simply accessing the kinds of social media that young people produce, or that they post, what they post online, or looking at them detached, but it's actually working with young people as co-analysts of these traces themselves. So this method is an interview method where we sit with participants and scroll back through their profiles, their news feeds, their histories, their socially mediated histories together. The participants really importantly drive this process, so they log into the platform on their device or on one provided, and each of these different approaches has different sensitivities, of course. And the researcher sits back and prompts, asks questions, asks them sometimes in some research projects to take a screenshot of something or to explain what they were thinking, or even to explain, what was left unsaid out of that status update, or what wasn't included in that Snapchat video, or what went into the thought process behind that Instagram caption, for example. So there are many different spaces where this kind of method could be used. It could be used, for example, as a starting point, could be Facebook profile pictures. So you could scroll back through profile pictures or forward to ask participants to reflect on different places in their lives. So to explain what their life was like when that photo was taken, or what was going on when they were with those group of friends, for example. You might also use it on Instagram to look at archive stories, which are more ephemeral kind of digital storytelling devices, or in the tagged photos on Instagram where their friends have tagged them, to get at different kinds of research questions that you might have. Other social media platforms like Reddit, where you could look at post histories or comment histories. YouTube, you could look at their watch histories together and look at the kinds of videos that they watch and ask them to explain and analyze those videos together, and perhaps not with children, but certainly with the young adults that I do a lot of research with, sort of from their late teens to late 20s is the group that I most often work with. We often look at dating apps as well, and the way that dating apps figure into networked publics. So I think this method is quite useful for understanding how people use, make sense of, and also reflect on social media. But it's also valuable as a prompt to get at research questions about other aspects of young people's lives. And I'll talk about this with one project in a minute. So it's useful to get a sense of how everyday life is made visible and recorded in digital spaces, and also to act as a prompt to reflect on storytelling about those more everyday experiences of young people. And we've written a couple of pieces on this research method that I've linked to here. One in the Journal of Qualitative Research, which was about uncovering longitudinal life narratives through our project on scrolling back on Facebook. So what do you get out of this method? I'm going to talk just very quickly about two specific projects. The first was the Facebook Timelines project, which I mentioned before, and the next one is on men's drinking cultures, which was not on social media use at all, but we used the social media scrollback method to reflect on men's drinking cultures in Victoria, where I live here in Australia. So with the Facebook Timelines project, what we were interested in was getting young people to share with us their reflections on how certain critical moments had been made visible and shared on Facebook. So we were interested in experiences of moving out of home, of graduating from school, of first jobs, early romantic relationships. And we were interested in what was made visible and what was hidden in social media spaces, in networked publics. In this project, we studied how disclosure practices had changed over time and how friends were co-constructing performances of identity in these spaces. But really importantly, we were also interested in what was left unsaid or also later erased. And the scroll back method, because you're sitting with research participants next to them, you can actually ask them what they were thinking when they posted that, or ask them what was later deleted. And you can't do that with other kinds of methods where you're sitting back and disconnected from the people who are posting and constructing the social media that researchers might be interested in. The other project was not specifically, as I said, about social media use, but it was about men's drinking cultures in Victoria. And we actually used the social media scroll back method to go back through our participants' Instagram and Facebook profiles to think about specific events where they were at a birthday party or at a music festival or at a graduation where they were drinking, and we asked them to reflect on the drinking practices in those spaces. So it was quite a useful device to prompt memory work, to prompt reflection beyond an abstraction. So there was a specific photo, tell us who was in this photo, what happened before and after, that kind of thing. So it was a prompt for memory work in that sense. So what are the challenges in terms of ethics, which of course is the important topic of your seminar today? What are the challenges and opportunities with this kind of social media scrollback method? One of the really key challenges for us in this method is about intentionality. Who were these digital traces of everyday life created for? Certainly not for us as researchers. You don't go onto social media, the everyday person doesn't go onto social media to record and post about their life in the hopes that a researcher might one day access it later, right? So that's really important sensitivity to negotiate. These are kind of organically constructed digital traces of lives, not a research journal or a photo project for a researcher. So it has to be treated with a high level of sensitivity. These were also co-constructed digital traces. So for example, in the Men's Drinking Cultures project, many of the photos we were looking at with our participants were actually posted by their friends and they were tagged in them. So, you know, what does it mean when you're scrolling through your own profile and the posts that constitute that profile are actually uploaded by other people? Where do the research ethics go here? And so this is something that we discussed with our participants. And it also raises questions about the labor involved in digitally mediated identities. So that's an important ethical challenge as well. You're not just dealing with the participants sat in front of you, you're also potentially dealing with their network of friends and contacts on social media. And of course, the other big challenge here is that these are not perfect kind of imaginings of young people's lives. These are highly contingent. As I said in the previous dot point, these posts, these digital traces are also shaped by not just friends, but also algorithms. So what Facebook decides to surface, or when we scroll back with people, what are the kind of images that are most liked, and the algorithm determines that they're the images to surface to the top of a kind of, you know, scroll back through various years, or what images are centered in a kind of look back video or a friendship celebration video. The algorithm and Facebook's systems play a role in surfacing certain posts over others. But also these archives are edited, they're co-constructed, sometimes with different audiences in mind. So if you end a relationship with one person, you might go back and delete those photos, or they might delete those photos of you, and so that trace is erased. But also we know that young people delete posts and change their privacy settings, even change their names on social media when they're looking for work. But there's also a real important host of opportunities here. So working with young people as co-analysts of their own digital traces, working with existing material, not material that was created specifically for a research project. And we think that this method can also be really important in thinking about reflecting on what's left unsaid, hidden, or later erased as well. So that's my 10 minutes up. Thanks again so much for the organisers of this event. I hope you have a really productive discussion. Here's some other research that I think is quite useful in this area. Michael Zimmer's work has for more than a decade now has really been important in thinking about internet research ethics. And I also want to refer to Fiesler and Preferez's work on participant perceptions of Twitter research ethics, where they actually did a survey of what people think about their tweets, for example, being used in research. And the results might surprise you. A lot of their participants did not like the idea of their public tweets being included in research, but they recommend a series of steps that we can take to negotiate this around anonymizing and paraphrasing that we've followed in other research using Reddit. But I'm not going to talk about that today, but here are some further links for further reading if you're interested. Thanks again, and have a great session.
Okay, so then we are back. So I say thank you to Brady, and I just want to also mention that Brady has said that he would be more than willing to engage with people in conversation on Twitter if they have comments. We will also be developing a resource on the core platform with a blog post and with an opportunity for people to comment and raise questions with us. And we will connect Brady and Giovanna and our other Vidar and Ingrid as well, if you would like to be able to follow this conversation and to interact with us on this topic afterwards. We have a couple of questions that have come in from our audience, and I think that one of the first questions that I think is also relevant maybe for us to take as a panel discussion focuses on this question of, I guess, the differences between the different kinds of consent, and the differences. We've talked a bit about the difference between ethical consent and legal consent. Giovanna, you also spoke about the difference between consent and assent. And I think that's the first question that we have today has come in terms of what happens when you go into a classroom situation or also potentially a classroom situation online, and you're trying to prepare for this. And in advance, you consider that you should seek consent, and the way in which you do it is by asking parents to inform you if they don't want their child to participate in the research process. So maybe if we could take that from your different kind of areas of expertise, just to talk about, well, what does this actually imply, and what might be the kind of ethical stumbling blocks or issues that you might encounter in that situation. I might ask you first, Elisabeth, to come in with that, and then Giovanna, and then Vidar and Ingrid as well. If you have reflections about it, that would be great to hear. Thank you.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you for starting with like a really, really hard question. So this is something that we have discussed a lot in my work also on the ethics committee, and it has to do with, I mean, there are ethical ramifications here that goes beyond this thing about, like, do you have to ask the parents, or what if the parents say no? And one of the ethicals draw up a couple of issues. Like, one is that if we create research in a way that children feel that they're left out, that they feel that the others get to participate in something, and I want to, but I cannot, and I'm left out, or I'm not special. Typical example would be that you ask the children who have not provided consent form from their parents to leave the classroom while you're conducting your research, or you're taking out those who have consent forms, and they get to go into another room and do something presumably fun and special, and they might get a lollipop or something as a token of appreciation. So there's a lot of issues here. On the last point, I would say that one of the things that we have discussed, and we typically would always recommend also in terms of methods, is that if you select children from a group and you only do research with some of them, the whole group is affected. So the whole group should have some sort of appreciation for having their day interrupted. You don't just give a lollipop to the children you actually surveyed. You give it to the whole class, or you give appreciation to the whole school or group. One of the things that we have discussed in Norway, and actually, and I'm sorry for bringing in the Norwegian context, but we had some workings in terms of legal changes, because there are situations where you, as a researcher, think that maybe the child's own consent you should put more value on that than those of their parents. So there are types of research where the parents will almost always say no, but it still could be beneficial and wishful for the child to participate. One of the extremes is, of course, in situations of research on parental abuse, where the parent might still have the legal opportunity to say, I don't want my child to participate in this research, but it is of interest for the child, perhaps, to research. In that comes this idea of what is the best age for an informed consent. And I think that the GDPR and other issues of collecting personal data creates dilemmas that we cannot solve yet, because collecting personal information and having, for instance, to be 16, and before that you have to have parental consent, is not necessarily the same as having the capacity to understand what an ethical informed consent is. Usually in these dilemmas, I would say more research is needed. But here I cannot see more research is needed. But maybe we could say more discussion within the research community is needed. This is not easy. I would also say that in line with this question, usually one would say that if you don't say anything, we just assume that you consent for your child to participate. So there's an opt-in consent is usually not considered legitimate. So it should be any truly informed ethical consent has to be an active consent. It cannot just be said, you didn't say that you didn't want to participate. It has to be opt-in, I want to participate. And that creates hence the problem. Maybe some of the others can solve it more than I can.
Thank you, Elisabeth. Giovanna, would you have something to add on that, just in terms of the assent and consent, the differences?
Well, just let me start with saying that I agree with Elisabeth, with what Elisabeth said, especially that we need active informed consent, and we need to make a distinction between legally informed consent and ethical consent. Just to stimulate the discussion, I remember reading once, if I don't mistake, it was a research project done by Lydia Plouman in Scotland. And if I don't mistake, she mentioned the case of a family of young children. And the parents agreed to their child taking part in the research. But when they eventually visited the child at home, he didn't want to participate. And so they did not include the child. So even though legally his parents had the power to sign the informed consent on his behalf, the child did not want to, and so they did not interview, and the child eventually did not participate in the study, which I think is a good practice to bear in mind. We should also, as Elisabeth suggested, that sometimes the child feel not pushed to participate, not really coerced to participate, not only by his parents, but if you're doing interviews or a survey in school, it could be a peer pressure for them that prevents them to actually actively say, no, I don't want to participate. And this is where non-verbal language again comes into play, in my perspective.
Great, thanks, Giovanna. That's brilliant. Thank you. And maybe Vidar, if you would also, and Ingrid, if you would also have something to say.
I could add 2 comments to the question of research with children in schools, because we have a lot of cases in NESH in the recent year concerning this. Some of these are related to surveys, but also qualitative research, ethnography, and video recording in school. But the 2 main points is that often the question is not an ethical problem or dilemma. It has to do with practical solutions and money, because these are usually often publicly funded projects, and there's a need for the research, but it costs extra to provide for that teacher who can take care of those who don't want to participate. So it's a practical school political funding problem, readdressed as an ethical problem. We've seen that in a lot of cases. The other point is that when public authorities want research, they can push that through legally by different legal instruments. And it is possible to make research in accordance with GDPR without consent, because quality assurance or something like that. We see cases where public authorities initiate huge, large-scale projects without consent, because it's legal, and then it becomes so evidently clear why the ethical consent is important, because the authorities, but as researchers, the ethical consent is still there to make to build the trust which is necessary in school and among children. So those two dimensions, which is on a different level, it has to do with funding, it has to do with politics and power as well.
Great, thank you. Ingrid, would you like to add to that question?
Just very quickly, we've also seen some interesting cases on medicine in Norway, which, I mean, both the NESH cases and the medicine cases show that it's so important to be context specific in this area. So consent needs to be considered within the frames of each country. And also, I'm thinking we need to educate the children on research, and hopefully Cora can add to that.
Great, thank you. I think actually you touched on an issue that's come up in one of the other questions that we have in the Q&A, which is the extent to which, when we review and consider ethical issues, we need to be aware of the cultural context in which they arise, so that what fits maybe in maybe the Norwegian ethical context might not actually be the same in another cultural context, and that there might be kind of particular specific issues that would arise there. I would ask you maybe to comment on that as well, because I think that I guess with the GDPR, we have this kind of European legal framework, and it maybe suggests that there is a more uniform approach. But if the panelists would have reflections about how ethical considerations are different from legal, again in that culturally specific context, that would be great. Thank you.
I was just I was trying to find the story, which has actually been described in our research ethics magazine. It had to do with the research on children with, what do you say, gulsott? Does anyone know the disease? Where
Jaundice.
Yeah, thank you. On babies in Tanzania. So the general rule in Norway is that you have to have consent from both mother and father when you do research on children. I guess that's the rule many places, but in this context, that was not that would not have been feasible, because the father was not present in the birth situation, and then you would lose the opportunity of research. And so the committee concluded that the research is so feasible for the children, so that they said that they didn't need the consent from the father as well. So that's just an example that sort of pushed the limits as to what our committees usually say. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Is it okay for you guys then? Oh, Elisabeth also has an answer to that. Yes, thank you.
Yes, because I've seen the comments that have come in, and one of them is I think it's being also a researcher and as Giovanna and as Neva's work on sensitive issues like online risk, and there's one question here that says, for instance, this required to do interviews about the sensitive topic about online risk with children as old as 16 in the presence of their parents in the room. And that introducing questions about exposure to pornography in online service was denied. And I think that is highlighting something. It's about cultural differences as well as accepted, but for me at least, it highlights something about what we need to do and what kind of conversations that we perhaps need to engage in with policymakers, with parents, with the legal frameworks about children's rights across the world. Because if we as researchers cannot provide ethical and good methods to actually help and understand what goes on in children's lives, for instance, asking a 16 or a 15-year-old about their experiences with online pornography with their parents in the room will not yield the same type of results and answers as if they were to be answered without their parents there. And we all know this. This is a methodological issue as well as an ethical one. So I think that if we as a research community across the world, we perhaps need to engage in children's rights to be participants in research. So it's not about only protecting children from researchers, it's also about protecting children's rights to have their voices heard in research. And I'm reminded by an example here from so many years ago when we started with the EU Kids Online project, which is a European project that specifically researches online risk and opportunities for children. When we did the first questionnaire, we had a discussion if we could ask children about their experiences with looking at what is called harmful sites online, like user-generated content, like people discussing how to kill themselves, commit suicide, self-harm sites. And I remember these discussions and saying that the perception was, but children don't do this. This is not something children do. And then of course the question is, how do we know? Because we have never asked them, because it's considered too sensitive. And when we asked the 11+ years old across Europe, it became evident that just being asked this question, we can uncover a practice where lots of children said that they would go to pro-suicide sites and self-harm sites and hate sites online, which had implications for how we can review children's online lives, but also risks, and that can actually aid practitioners and others that can help children. So the right to be researched, and for us to combine ethics and methods in an excellent way, convincing people that children should have the right to be asked hard questions, I think would be something to aim for.
Great, thank you, Elisabeth. So I just want to say as well that we will try to answer as many questions as we can now, but we also will record the questions and try to publish these on our website so that we can come back to you with answers and maybe link to additional resources as well. So there's another question that has come in here from Caroline Överlien, who asks about the question or the topic, I guess, of ongoing consent in online interviews. So when we're talking about or interviewing about sensitive topics with children and young people in an online interview context, how can we deal with the question, I guess, of ongoing consent? So where the interview starts moving into a topic which the person might not be comfortable with, how can we try to pick up on the cues that we would see maybe clearer? We might see body language or reactions a bit clearer, I guess, in a face-to-face situation. How can we kind of try to respond to those in online interview situations?
Shall I? Okay. So what I usually do when I do interviews, whether online or offline, I also, because no matter how friendly I tend to be, I'm an adult, and so I'm more likely to be compared to a teacher. So I start by saying that there are no wrong and right answers, and if they don't feel comfortable about replying certain questions, they just can ignore it and say that they are not comfortable with it. So this would set set a trustful relationship from the very beginning. So this is the first thing I should do. And then I think we can, despite more limited cues, I think we could still get a sense of when a child or a young people feels uncomfortable, even if we are just meeting face to face. So for example, a long silence, which either mean that they did not understand the question, or that they really are not comfortable enough to answer, or I don't know, other, for example, if they start moving around, moving their hands, or they I don't know, their facial expression might signal not being comfortable or being upset about something we have said. I think it's more complicated, but I think, and it's more complicated on part of the researchers, because it requires us to be much more focused, much more careful than it would be in offline situation, but I think it's not impossible.
Thank you, Giovanna. I think Elisabeth also wanted to say something to that question.
Yeah, I was just going to comment on the it's like with the GDPR and collecting personal information, that it's perhaps not ethical, as we know, to say that I want you to participate in it, but I'm going to use your information for whatever, you know, for eternity, for whatever I might figure. And it's sort of the same thing with this very problematic but very, very exciting prospect of following informants over time. So maybe sometimes the ethical or the easiest thing to do is to actually go through that process, planning ahead, and then go through that process of regularly having a routine for confirming the consent, so that it's not this silent sort of confirmation we keep talking to each other. Also because of this trust level, as Giovanna said, that children might feel like, well, now we're friends, you know, we meet regularly. I share with you about my stories and my life. So you might want to consider having a process where you regularly, every year or so, you would renew the consent practically, so that you would have a new consent form saying, I would like to continue, you know, these are the ramifications that enables you to have a technical way to have both you and the informants think about, we are actually doing research, we're not just socializing. Not that is the case, but sometimes, you know, interviews, especially unstructured interviews, can go in all kinds of directions. So it's sometimes good to remind, at least in my own experience, the informants that I'm actually the researcher and you're the informant, and we're not going to the movies after this together.
Great, thank you, Elisabeth. I think I'm smiling because I have experiences of that situation as well, particularly in social media research, where you kind of engage with and observe research informants over time, and it's important to kind of remember what the actual relationship is, which is again confused by friendship relationships as well. There's another question here from Sophia Serholt, who asks about classroom research. So what her question specifically is, if parents decline having their child participate in a field study, would it be ethical to let the child take part in the activities but not collect data from that child if the teacher says it's okay? So this could, for example, be related to testing some technology in a classroom. Maybe this would be actually relevant for you, Giovanna, as well, considering the research that you have done.
No, I'm looking forward, to be honest, and looking backward to the research we've done with the EU Kids Online Network, and forward to the research we are going to do within ySKILLS. So we will have 3 waves of data collection in schools. And the problem we are going to discuss is precisely how is this going to take place, because we plan to do the first wave of data collection in March, April 2021, but it may not be possible for us to physically enter the school. And so if we did the survey online, then it would be without us being present there, then it would be very complicated to actually not collect data from a particular child, but let them participate in the activity. So ideally, to answer to Sophia's questions, I would say yes, definitely let them participate, provided that you do not collect information from them. And this could be easier if you do an offline, physically co-present observation, for example. And you abstain from taking notes and writing down verbal quotes from that particular child. But if you do an online survey, then where each respondent is assigned a code, how could you do? I don't know. I'm just wondering. Probably Ingrid has some on this.
No, I was just thinking, why don't you ask the parents either to consent or inform the parents that this will be the case? So that I'm just thinking, as a parent, I would feel like I was being fooled if my child came home from school and I'd said I didn't give consent to this research, and the child said, well, I was part of it. It wouldn't make me insecure. So why don't you just put this as part of the consent, or as a part of the information, if that's the deal with the teacher or the school?
Great, thank you. Thanks for interesting questions and answers. I think we have time for just one more brief question, which has come in, and it's about withdrawal of consent. And perhaps Vidar and Elisabeth would have some specific comments about this. But the question is, and it's, the attendee says it's probably not internet specific, but is more general than that. But when a project which analyzes how children interact in a group, and there are several recorded sessions, so where consent forms were collected, including a clause that both videos and data can be used further in research. And then the analysis starts, but then one of the children or their parents withdraws the consent. Do you have any kind of tips about how we can think ahead or plan for that, including avoiding potential negative consequences for the research and the results that might arise? So maybe some experiences of how this has been dealt with in committee work previously, if you would have anything to say about that. Vidar or Elisabeth specifically, perhaps.
Vidar, do you want to go first, or should I?
Yes, please go here.
Okay, so this is super hard. I think it's something we all struggle with, and this idea of you can withdraw your consent at any time, but as researchers, that's really hard. And not all methods are. It's different in types of methods you use, but just generally a couple of tips that might help. One is that in your head and in your work, the two best friends should be methods and ethics. So you should really consider this together. And if you plan, think through all these potential pitfalls, things that can happen. And in my experience, you need to really be creative in thinking about what could happen and think this is not likely, because things happen. I mean, the things that happen, you're dealing with people. People are irrational, and so they will do all sorts of things once you started messing with their lives as researcher. So plan for it, and then what you inform your informants about and how you will use it and the process will aid you. So one is that they can be assured that this will happen. Another thing is that you can, if your method allows for it, you can say that up until the moment, so your child can be identified as an individual, you can withdraw. But after the data is transferred into a form where it's not possible to differentiate different informants, then that's too late. That's one way of doing it, but not all methods allow for this, but that's something you can do. But I think, and it's really, really hard, and this is perhaps the reason why I think we need to have more webinars soon on ethical issues, because some of these are, it go into that. But pre-information is basically the only way you can use that, like in Monopoly, your get out of jail free card. That's when you get to inform your informants about, this is what I do, this is the routine. And after that, it's up to them. That's what the whole free and informed consent is about. The free part is about they actually get to decide. So sorry, Vidar, I don't know if you have anything.
Just filling in, I mean, you covered it basically. So it goes, I mean, it's a version of sort of precautionary principle. You need to sort of plan ahead to avoid bad consequences. And the more you plan, the more you inform people. And also the process Elisabeth described earlier about sort of reaffirming trust, reaffirming consent throughout the process. The more you sort of work to preempt those possibilities, the better off you are. But people have these rights, so we just need to plan in accordance with it.
Great, thank you, Vidar. I just want to say thank you for everybody, to everybody who took the time to be here today, particularly to our panelists for very interesting presentations, but also to the attendees for coming and listening and asking very interesting questions. We have run out of time, but we want to keep this conversation going, and this is part of what the CORE project is about. So CORE, the full title is Children Online Research and Evidence. So if you look this up on the website, and we'll post a link in Twitter afterwards as well. But just here we will build an online resource. We will link to articles, to guidelines, etc. that you can see. But we would also really like to have your questions and comments there so that we can kind of keep this conversation going and keep discussing, because it's only through having an online or an ongoing, excuse me, an ongoing discussion that we can really keep these issues fresh and keep kind of aware of what people are experiencing in research as well. So with that, I think I will say thank you very much. Thank you to all the panelists, and we'll see you hopefully at our next webinar, which you will find more information about soon. Thank you.